Just thought I'd pop in to warn you that this is a long video, but there is a lot in it. Lots of techniques, make your own embossing paste, show you how to make a faux leather look with a sheet of paper and some water, obviously the project itself. So there's lots of little things that you might learn along the way. Feel free to fast forward the bits you're not interested in, but just wanted to pop in and say that although this is a fun creation, it definitely took a while to make, so therefore the video is a bit longer than usual. As you know, I like to give you as many details as possible, hence the length of this video. Why not watch it in 3 stages, make it into a serial? Hi everyone, recently I went to a workshop with the MDF Man and the lovely Karen, and we learnt how to turn his MDF blank into a lovely altered book. The kind of book that you see people have done where they've taken an old book and cut the centre out to reveal an aperture which they then put something inside. Well, he and Karen had the very clever idea of making a blank with a piece of MDF, and you've got 2 pieces of board to make the cover. That's how the little kits come, and he also does another one with a couple of apertures. I think there are 4 little oval apertures in the sort of same size of MDF blank. So this is something that was taught to me, and I wanted to pass it on to you because I think it's a very clever idea, and it's full of all sorts of exciting possibilities. You're going to need to use textured paste to make your faux pages on the MDF blank, and that gave me the ideal opportunity to try out a recipe that I found on the internet, which was 1 part paint to 1 part talc. I'm just using a baby talc to 1 part PVA glue, which I had a great deal of trouble trying to get out of the bottom of this very old large container of PVA glue, and then you mix it all together to form a thick buttery paste. If you want to, if your paint or your glue was a little bit runny, you can easily add more talc, just exactly like you would if you were making icing, to the mixture if you wanted to make it a little bit thicker. So I'm going to show you now how to make the faux book pages. So I'm going to start, although it looks like you probably would be better off starting on the outside to make your pages, I'm going to start on the inside of the oval. Now you can imagine that if you had done this with a real book, you would have carefully cut out lots and lots and lots of ovals throughout the thickness of the book, so you would actually be able to see the size of your pages within your oval aperture. So that's what we're going to create, a set of faux pages on the inside of the aperture of the book, and then we'll move on to the outside to create some more faux pages, which you will see when the book is closed. So this section you will see when the book is open, and you can fill this aperture with whatever you decide. I've decided to do a Christmas book for this one, and you could use it perhaps to keep valuables safe if you wanted to, just to make something look like a book. Put it in your bookshelf, and you could quite easily keep you know, something that you wanted to keep safe. So it's a little bit awkward. I'm just using it's not exactly a palette knife, but a similar kind of thing. Palette knife would work just to scrape a layer or to wipe a layer of the paste all the way around that inside oval. So I'd say I've got between 1 millimetre and 2 millimetres thickness. And I'm just smoothing it out a little bit. Before I start to add the texture that will look like faux pages. I'm just making sure I haven't got any really thick areas, trying to make it quite even all the way around. It's a little bit tricky, as I said. So we're going to use a comb to make the actual texture of pages, but before you begin you want to just remove any paste that you've got on the outside of your book or the outside of your aperture, and then you're going to run a comb around the inside. Now I'm going to try and do it as straight as possible. The temptation, because you're actually working around that aperture on the inside of the book, is that you can't keep the comb straight, so concentrate on trying to keep the comb straight, and I would suggest doing half of the oval at a time. If the paste seems to be drying, I found it quite helpful to have a little spray handy, and if the comb blocks up, to remove the excess and then just run it around again if you get any huge lumps of embossing paste left behind by the comb. So again, I'm just removing any excess pieces of the paste from the outside of the book, because if you don't remove it, you'll have to sand it off, because it will cause lumps on the other things that you want to do with this, what will become the body of the book. So it's probably taken me a while longer than it would somebody who's used to working with paste. Just got a little piece at the bottom that I'm not quite happy with, and the beauty of this is you can just either wipe all your paste off and start again, or just redo a little section, which is what I'm doing here. So you can see here it's starting to look like the texture of pages, and once we start inking this when it's dry, you'll see it becomes a whole lot more lifelike. And then I'm going to be doing the same process on the outside edges, and the outside edges are much easier because it's easier to get a nice thin layer, a thin even layer of the paste. And one tip that I will say, if you're working in a very warm room, then just keep that spray of water handy, and it just helps things to stop it from drying out. And you can see there it just works a little bit quicker and easier when you're just working on one straight edge. Remember to keep removing the excess paste from the front edges, or the top and bottom edges of your book shape. Try not to put your fingers in it. And then again, I'm repeating the process on the long edge. So this is definitely a lovely messy technique. You can get your fingers dirty, your craft mat dirty. But the beauty of it is, while it's still wet, it's easy to wipe it up with a baby wipe or a wet cloth. And then last but not least, the third and final edge of the outside of the book. Okay, and you'll see that it definitely becomes more realistic a bit later on once it's dry. So put it to one side, and this is just literally me testing out the actual paste itself. The beauty of making the paste yourself is you can make it any colour. You can see here that I used a sort of buff coloured paint because I wanted I'm wanting this book to look quite old. So I'm just getting out a couple of stencils and seeing how the paste performs on a card surface, and how easy it is to spread and how quickly it takes to dry, and that once it's dry that it still adheres to this card surface, which is what you want from an embossing paste. So just giving my Tim Holtz stencils a run for their money. Definitely make sure that you have somewhere handy to put your stencils while you're working, to keep them from drying out. You don't want that paste to dry on your stencils. I know that I'm going to be really quick here. Just thinking about, could I stick bits and pieces of small items into the paste. So I've just done a nice thick layer, just run out of the room for a minute to get some beads. So just adding some glitter to start with. This is distress glitter, just patting it into the surface of the paste, and then just pushing in some beads. And I can already tell I've probably not got quite a thick enough layer to hold something like these beads in position. And the reason for adding a thick layer is just to see if you can stamp into it here, and really it sticks to your stamp basically, and you could make texture with it, but you can't really get a defined image of a stamp. So you definitely can get lots and lots of texture, as you can see here, So great for mixed media projects. So already those thin layers that I put through the stencils are starting to dry, so that's a good sign. I started to use my heat gun on some of those thinner areas, and I could see that I wasn't having any problems with it cracking. So you could use your heat gun to dry this homemade embossing paste if you wanted to. Definitely doesn't work so well on the thick because you'd be there a long time, so I definitely recommend if you've got any thick areas that you can leave it for a while to dry thoroughly. You can see it's still squidgy underneath. So just trying the cracking test, making sure that it's actually bonded to the surface and isn't going to flake off. So just giving it a little bit of a rub, and it's staying in place, not coming off on my hands, and also giving it a little bit of a bend to see if it will crack. So it's actually nice and quite tactile. Once it feels warm to the touch, then it's dry. So this area is still a little bit tacky, but definitely that glitter has stayed in place. That's quite a nice finish actually, I quite like that. Definitely want to try it later, but those beads are definitely going to pop out. I can see they're going to pop out. And I should imagine that the thicker paste will crack if it's too thick. So you can see it's still a bit squidgy here. It almost makes me wonder if you did it quite thick whether you could even mould with it and then let it dry. I'm really happy with that recipe, definitely worth giving a try, and I'll just let you know that I did put some into a container and it lasted definitely over a week. I've had it in a container. I still went back to it and it was perfectly good to use, so I've just stored it in one of those Chinese containers. I'm just drying off the edges of my book so that it's ready to add the ink to make it look even more like book pages. So whilst that's drying, I'm going to start work on the cover. So we get our two pieces of board that are bigger than the insert, and we need to add a spine. So I'm just measuring that curved spine of the book plus the length of the book cover, and I'm going to cut a piece of chipboard that will form the spine of the book. So you want to use something that you can bend because it's going to curve around the spine itself. I've actually written the wrong measurements on there because I do trim this down to 3/4 of an inch. I have a attempt at this and it doesn't quite work. So remember that the spine is 3/4 of an inch by 6 7/8, which is the height of the book. So the next thing that I wanted to do is create a faux leather cover. This definitely wants to look very old, and I want sort of leather look in order to do that. Now I've seen this done by people using glycerine, but I don't happen to have any of that in my cupboard, so I'm going to try the same effect just using water. So I've got two pieces of cardstock to try it with. Both of them are dark blue. This is a normal, what I would call a normal cardstock, and the second piece is a pearlized cardstock. Now I've noticed straight away as I start the crumpling of this piece of paper, which I have misted with water, I'm being a little bit careful. I'm fast forwarding it, but as I'm scrunching this up, I'm just doing it quite gently so that I don't rip the paper. But already this paper is starting to give way and flake. It's quite an absorbent paper, which is why I think the hole has appeared in it as I've been screwing this up and then unraveling it and screwing it back up again. So I'm going to get another piece of card. So it's always worth showing you how sometimes things go wrong so that you can sort of make the same judgments when you're trying out different pieces of card from your scrapbook cupboard. So this is a pearlized cardstock. Again, I'm being quite gentle as I start to make the crinkles in the card, and I've sprayed it with water on both sides. You don't want it soaking wet, just damp. You can feel that the card is starting to soak up that water. You may notice that you get a bit of ink on your fingers from the card, released from the card, depending on how it's been coloured. This is definitely a project where you get nice and messy. And once you're happy that you've got enough crinkles in your paper and it starts to look like old leather, then you start to smooth it out, and we're going to attach it to our book. So you're going to need it roughly 1/2 inch bigger than the actual cover of the book itself. So the 1/2 inch all the way around allows you to wrap to the inside of your cover. So I'm adding glue all over my actual book cover, and I am spreading it out with my finger because I want good adhesion to the chipboard. I don't want any gaps, I don't want the leather lifting away from, or my faux leather lifting away from my book cover. So I'm taking time to make sure I really press it down, and that's where the sort of leather look really starts to take shape. It looks less like crinkled paper and more like leather once it's attached to the pieces that will form the book cover. So I'm adding my spine and just leaving a little bit of a gap so I can easily lift the cover up and down on either side of the spine, and then repeating the process with the second piece. You can see I'm going a little bit crooked here, but as long as you've got a 1/2 inch worth of paper top and bottom, you'll be able to wrap that around the edge of the book. I obviously didn't notice at the time that I was going quite so crooked, but I'll just trim that up as I trim away the excess all the way around the cover. So at this point you might want to check that your spine is going to wrap neatly around the spine of your book. You want to start to curve that chipboard, and I found the easiest way to do that was either to use the edge of your table or press it around something like a rolling pin, just to start that slight curving of the spine, because you're going to be gluing that around the actual internal part of the book. And then you're ready to start wrapping the excess faux leather around the edge of your book. Again, you want to make sure this really does get pressed down well for a nice finish on the edges of your cover. So take a nice bit of time and use something like a bone folder just to make sure it's really pressed down well across the edges of your book. So you can see I'm just adding a little cut at both edges to enable me to lift this section over the edge of the book. So the first time I cut 2 little cuts either side of the spine, but you actually don't really need to do that. You can do that in one piece. So now I'm just cutting the end. You can see it's starting to take shape. Now you might have your own way of wrapping things like this. I like to just mark the corners of my final section, and that way when I wrap the paper over I get a nice mitered finish. And again, making sure it's nicely pressed into place. So I'll just show you that piece again on the other side. So I'm just marking from the outside corner to the inside corner where the 2 strips of paper meet. That forms my mitre, trimming those pieces of paper away and then gluing the edge of the paper into position. Now it's at this point where I started to fear that my spine was maybe just a little bit too wide for my book, and a bit later on I do recover this. So remember that the spine is 3/4 of an inch wide, not 1 inch as I've written on the spine. Now the trick is to just keep working that spine so that when you're ready to add the cover to the book that it hugs the curve of the spine itself. You can see it's going to sit slightly smaller than the outside of the book, which is exactly how book pages would be. So the next thing that I want to do is actually decorate what will become the back of the Aperture. Now you can imagine if we'd cut through this and this was all book pages, you'd leave a couple of book pages at the bottom of your Aperture. Well, I'm going to create that, and I've decided which side is the back, and I've written on that so I don't forget part the way through the process. So if you want to do something like this, definitely something you want to do over a few days, because you need things to dry, and it's just more enjoyable if you don't try to do it all at once. So I'm coming back on another day and I'm sanding my pages, and or what will become my pages, just taking off the little rough bits that may have been left over from when I have combed the surface. Be a little bit careful, this is an MDF centre. This is quite a fine sandpaper, so I know I'm only actually using my sandpaper on the actual paste, not on the MDF itself. I'm just very, very lightly taking it over the surface and getting rid of any rough edges. And then before you get on with your inking, you just want to wipe things down. Wipe the surface that you've been sanding with a wet wipe, and obviously clear away any dust that you've created on your work surface. You might have a little hoover for this. I'm just using an old makeup brush and just being careful not to flick the dust everywhere and get rid of it from my work surface. So now I'm going to create that look of old pages with my ink. So I'm changing the colour of the surface that I've laid down with the embossing paste, and I'm just randomly adding patches of the mahogany, aged mahogany, and I'm using, I think it's gathered twigs, if I remember rightly. I can't see the lid of it here and I can't really remember what I used. A brown anyway, ink. And then what I'm doing is I'm spraying the ink to make sure that it gets into all of those crevices that we created when we combed the surface of the embossing powder. Embossing paste. And then I'm repeating that process on the inside pages. I'm just using a little bit of water to make sure that all that ink finds its way to all the indentations we've created. You can see already it's starting to take on the colour of the sides of old books. Now at this point I did feel that it just wasn't getting into all those crevices, so I'm just trying to get it right inside by using a brush rather than a sponge. And then I spray the little puddles of ink I'm creating on my messy mat with the water just to turn it a little bit more liquid. To darken things up even further, I've got a vintage photo distress stain, and you can see now that's much darker and definitely getting into those nooks and crannies. And then I'm drying it all off with my heat gun, clearing all the ink out of the way. And at the moment it all looks a bit one-dimensional, so make sure that all the ink is dry, and then just lightly sand the edges and you can see those book pages appear. So you've got the different tones created by using the two shades of ink, and the recesses of the page have been filled in by the darker ink. Now I'm just taking, because that's quite light, the colour of my embossing powder was light, I'm just taking some old paper ink just to tone them down slightly. Now had I made a slightly darker embossing paste, I wouldn't have needed to do that. But now we're starting to think about the inside of the book, and I've printed out some old book pages from a Christmas book. So this will be in essence the back page of my book that I'd still be able to see. Had I cut all those pages away, I'd have left a page or two at the bottom to form the bottom of the Aperture. So I've just printed out some Christmas words. I think it's the story of a story similar to the "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." And then I need to glue it in position on the back of my book. Just overlapping what would be the leather cover and attaching the book page nice and smoothly on the back of what will be my Aperture. So you're going to be able to see that piece through the Aperture, and you can see things really starting to take shape. So just tracing around the Aperture with my pencil so I know where I'm going to be doing all of my design work. And I want to create a night scene on this back panel. So I'm just thinking about the size of the moon that would be appropriate. I've decided I can use this 1.5 inch circle punch, which I'm proceeding to get stuck in the punch. And I'm just going to use that as a mask. Now you may have seen me use this technique before to create a faux moon. Lots of faux things happening, lots of tricks to make things look like the real McCoy. So I've got my perfect medium re-inker. I've added a little bit of ink to a piece of foam and I've just lightly stippled over that mask. So I've got some clear embossing powder, and I definitely want to make sure it's mottled. So if you've got coverage that's a little bit too much, you can just remove a few speckles of the embossing powder with your paintbrush and then heat set your moon in the normal way. So that's clear embossing powder on my moon, and then I'm going to reveal the surface or reveal the moon by inking the sky. So I'm not going for a black sky, I'm using blue in order to create kind of slightly just coming into the evening sky. And I've got 2 shades of blue, one slightly darker than the other, and then just using an ink blending tool to blend the two together. Now at this point I want this sky to look snowy. I'm creating a snowy scene in the Aperture of this Christmas book. So you can see things starting to take shape. So I'm just going to take a little bit of water and flick that over the surface to start with, and that will just create me some light areas and start to add the look of snow to this night sky. And then I'm just taking a little bit of white paint and then making it nice and runny, and then just tapping my paintbrush over the surface and just tap until you're happy with the amount of snow in your blizzard. And I could have quite easily covered up the edges of my book to stop me having to wipe it, but as long as you're quick, just take a wet wipe over the surface of the edge of your book to remove any white spots from that leather. And then if you just look at that through the Aperture, you can see we've started to create our snowy scene. And making sure that your distress ink is dry, I'm just taking a glue pen, adding some more snow, but this time I'm going to make it twinkle. So I've just got some glamour dust and I'm just adding that over those little tiny dots of snow just to add a little bit of sparkle. And it's definitely difficult to show any kind of glitter on camera, but be sure it's quite subtle, but it's definitely there. So what is going to stand in our snowy scene? I want to use these Christmas trees. These are from Tim Holtz. They're from the set where you get one large tree, one small tree and a wreath, and they're all made from I don't know what the actual material is, but it's a material that takes on your distress inks or other inks that you might have. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time turning these green, and I'm using evergreen bough and pine needles, perfect names for turning cream Christmas trees into green Christmas trees. Now, if you're someone who doesn't like getting your fingers dirty, then you definitely would want to put on a set of gloves at this point, because you do need to get your fingers in there to make sure that ink goes all the way through. They're almost like bottle brushes, these trees, and I'm just getting them nice and green, ready to go into my Christmas landscape. And then I'm just rubbing them with slightly darker green and to add a second shade of colour. I'm not sure if there's more on me or on my trees. So once you're happy, I seem to have something stuck to my sleeve, I've noticed. I'm not sure what it is. I think it might be the moon that I cut out earlier because it looks quite round. What you want to do is attach your book Aperture into place next, ready to create your scene within it. So I've done the actual back plate where you'll be able to see through the aperture to the sky behind, and I'm using the glue to keep that in position. Not sure where my trees are going to go just yet, but just thinking about the hills that I have that these trees are growing in. And I've got some nice thick white paste. This time this is a bought one that I just happened to find in my cupboard. I've had it for ages, so I'm going to give it a try. I want to create a really thick layer of snow as if it's coming forward in the aperture. I don't want this flat in the back. I want to really build it up so that it comes forward in the aperture. I added this paste might be a little bit too runny, so I'm adding some talc to it and stirring it up so it becomes nice and thick. Now, I have no idea whether this is going to work, but as it happens, I've seen the end, and it does. So it might be something, if you've got embossing paste that's perhaps a little bit runnier than you might like, you might want to try adding a little bit of talc. And I wish I'd seen that little moon sticking to my arm. So you can see here, I'm really spreading this stuff really thick. The only thing that I'm being careful of is to create a nice sort of horizon line at the back of the hill. It looks like one of those flying saucer sweeties attached to my sleeve. Now, I am quite prepared that this will crack as it dries, but once I've got the main body of my hills dried and in place, then I'm more than happy to fill in those cracks afterwards. So just really working that paste until I'm happy with the contours of those hills. So now I want to add some snow to my little Christmas trees. So I'm just brushing that same paste on with my fingers. Now I did find that this did take up a little bit of that green colour, so I will come back in a bit later on to add a little bit more just to whiten things up a bit. And you can imagine that in between all of these things, that piece of paper makes me laugh. In between all of these things, you are going to be allowing elements of this to dry. So adding the snow, and then of course my snow needs to sparkle a little bit. So I'm going to be adding the sparkle with a little bit of that glamour dust. So I'm just doing that off camera over a bin and just twizzling the tree as I just sprinkle a little bit of glitter over the tree. Lots of cleaning up to do in between stages, and you can see my fingers are getting really mucky now. So I did think that I really wouldn't need to add much else to my Christmas scene other than my trees, but I did think I might want a little sign, a little bit of Christmas magic. So I want to create a little hanging sign that says "This way to the North Pole." So I'm going to use a barbecue skewer in order to do that. And I've started the process by painting the end of the skewer with some white acrylic paint. So now I'm filling out the rest of the snow, ready to add my trees. So really building it up into the foreground of the aperture so that I look like I'm looking into some snowy hills. Could be Narnia, couldn't it? I could have done Narnia rather than This Way to the North Pole. It could be actually that'd be quite nice to do a storybook, wouldn't it? And then create a storybook scene inside one of these apertures. But then I'm taking all sorts of bits of sparkle to show that this is snow, to give it a little bit of glisten. I'm going to do some rock candy glitter, and I've also got a little bit of glamour dust. So I'm doing all of that whilst this snow is wet. So now for the trees, just wondering whether to leave the bases on them and actually where to position them. The trees have dried, so I'm just pulling off those bases and then pushing the tree into the snowy hill. So you want to make sure that your tree isn't going to stick above the aperture and that it's well secured with the snow at the base. And as best you can to have the tree growing straight. So it's a little bit awkward because the bottom branches are pushing the tree away. So I'm just going to use that little pot to hold it in place. And then deciding where to add the second tree. And I'm going to sit it at the bottom of this hill. So again, just making sure that it's not going to stick out above the aperture and making sure it's secured in the snow at the base. Then I'm happy with that, so I'm just giving it a gentle test with the cover to make sure that it's not going to be sticking out too far. So I've decided to use a wooden bead at the end of the skewer, and I want a red and white look to my little hanging sign, so just adding some glue into the whole of the bead and then sticking that in position on my barbecue skewer. So just taking away the excess glue and then pulling it into position. And then letting it dry. I held my barbecue skewer in the position that I wanted it to be in the aperture just to decide how long the little hanging sign could be and the proportions of the hanging sign, and I've cut myself a little arrow which will become the actual sign itself in a little piece of chipboard. I must have taken a break at this stage, so I've come back. It must be the next day. My fingers are much cleaner and I'm just showing you that as I suspected, the actual snow itself has cracked because it is very thick, but not too badly. So I'm going to be able to come back in with a little bit of excess paste and just fill in those cracks and re-glitter, and the snow will look as good as new. And I quite like the way the ink that I blended on the pages has just coloured the edge of the snow slightly, because it does add to that air of age, which is the thing that I'm going for with the whole of this book. So that's the actual piece that the sign is going to hang from, and now it's time to decorate it, ready to hang in the aperture of the book. So I'm thinking candy canes as I decorate my little hanging sign, and I'm going to base coat the chipboard in the white. So this will be where I will write "This way to the North Pole" or words to that effect. Make sure that you base coat the edges, and then I'm going to colour the bead at the end of the pole in a red acrylic paint. And I did think that I could freehand a swirl around the pole, but this barbecue skewer, although it looks round on camera, when I came to paint it, it is a little bit square. So I just wasn't happy that this was a neat enough finish for what I wanted to achieve. And you can see that I'm going to give up, paint it white, and I'm going to wrap a thin piece of red card instead. But before I do, I want to create a red frame around the edge of my little hanging sign. And then painting out those stripes. I'm just doing a second coat because it went a little bit pink. Oh, nearly red again. And then painting the back of the sign with the red. Then I've cut myself a really, really thin strip of red cardstock, and I'm just adding glue along the strip. And then I'm going to wrap the strip in a spiral around my barbecue skewer. And already you can see it's finer and it's neater, and I'm much happier with the result. So putting that to one side, the next thing that we want to create are the pages that would be on the inside of your book. So the pages that lead up to the discovery of the aperture. And all I did was head straight for my internet on the computer, and I looked for Christmas book pages, and I put a few pages that I found that I liked together to form just a couple of pages that I want to use in the front of the book. So I've decided the 2 picture pages are going to be the inside cover and the first page of my book, and then I've got some Christmas sheet music for my second set of pages and my third set of pages. Now in my third set of pages, one of those will be attached over the front of the aperture, and then I will cut the aperture from that page. So I'm trimming them to size, and it's at this point that I noticed the measurement on my spine, and I remember I didn't make the spine smaller, I made it bigger. So ignore what I said before about going from a 1-inch spine to a 3/4 of an inch spine. I went slightly bigger, and the reason I went slightly bigger was with the 1-inch spine, it was just a little bit too short in the fact that once I tried to wrap it around the actual MDF, then the book didn't, your pages are slightly smaller than your book, and I couldn't get it to do that. It just wanted to pull it right so that everything was level. So I had to create a slightly wider spine. So the spine that I used measured 1¼ inches, and I'll put a note right at the beginning to say that just ignore that first comment. I meant 1¼ inches. So again, I'm just trimming up these pages so that they're all the same size, and I'm going to glue them together to form a little booklet. So you can see here that this piece of sheet music will be the one that's attached over the aperture. Then I'll recut the aperture as if that was the book page where the aperture had been cut, or was the first page of the aperture. So it really is worth taking your time to make sure that your pages fit exactly and are exactly the same size as the MDF blank. And you can see here how I'm forming my booklet by stacking my pages, or my pairs of pages, one on top of the other. So always remember to check that everything is the same way around. A bit like when you put your card in and then open your card and realise that it's upside down. So I've got the what turned out to be like 4 pages of Christmas songs, and then my Christmas prints for the first 2 pages. So once I've got everything in place, then I'm going to trim everything to size so that they all look like single pages rather than 2 pieces of paper stuck together. And then I'm just taking my old paper distress ink and adding ink around the edges of those sheet music pages to make them look as if I've had them for years, or maybe my grandmother had them for years, because of course it's not possible that I've had them for that many years. You really can find some great images on the internet to use in your crafting. Pinterest is a great place to start. Lots of sharing of images over there, and I just drop mine into Word, size them to whatever I intend to use them for, and then print them out. So I'm not too worried about the centre of this one because we're going to cut it away. And then using a slightly darker ink, I'm using Vintage Photo. No, I'm not. Tell a lie, I'm using frayed burlap. And like I said, just trimming away the pages that you might be able to see underneath to make them look like they're one page. So adding glue around the aperture, ready to attach what is actually the bottom page of my pile of pages. So making sure that the edge is lined up with the edge of the book, and it's worth letting this dry a little bit before you try to cut out the aperture, because otherwise you might end up tearing your page. And the other thing to do is gently make sure everything is really well adhered by pressing down either with your finger or with a bone folder and making sure that that page is properly attached. You can see here, because my glue is still wet, you can quite easily take off the surface of your paper if you're not careful. As it happens, because this is going to look aged, that won't matter too much. So just drying everything off, and then I'm taking the blade of my craft knife, and you're okay once you've found the very edge. Now be careful where the snow is, because obviously you can't get the blade in fully as you can round where the sky is. So you might want to just remove a little piece so you can see exactly what you're doing. I found that cutting towards myself was a little bit easier to get the right angle on the blade, and if I had any extra pieces of paper I just trimmed them off afterwards. So where you come into contact with the snow, you just have to be a little bit careful not to cut into the snow, particularly if it's damp at all. Just tidying up the edges with a craft knife. And coming back in with my frayed burlap and just inking around the entire edge of the aperture. So when you open this book, it will look like a normal book until you get to the page that reveals the aperture. So next we want to glue the spine into position. And again, it's worth taking your time to make sure that this is adhered properly. Really make sure that's stuck firmly to the rounded edge of the MDF blank. Just removing any excess glue as you tightly press the spine to the MDF. And then once you're happy that that's sticking, you can attach the inside page to the inside cover. And then once I was happy with the placement of my pages, then I just closed the book and added a little bit of weight to the top of it so that everything was flattened and stuck down well. Stampin' Up punches or any heavy punches are quite good for this kind of job. So then moving on, probably the next day, to fix my snow and to finish this book off. So I think it actually was probably more or less a week by the time I got back to using this paste. So I'd mixed it and just put it into an airtight container. This is just an old Chinese container, and it lasted fine. So I'm not sure how long it would last. It was maybe starting to be a little bit drier than it had started. So I'm just going to take a palette knife and just fill in those cracks exactly like you would fill in any cracks that you had in your plaster on your walls at home. So I'm taking a little bit of care to smooth it out a little bit, but the glitter that I'm going to add in a moment will hide the fact that there was ever a crack here at all. And then once I was happy that I'd filled in the little cracks that I did have, all that was left to do was add my little concoction of glitter to finish off that glittery snow. And now I want to finish off my sign, just testing whether my words will fit. So I've got North Pole this way. And then I want to make this sign hang from the pole. So I've got some old pieces of jewellery that I keep in a little box, little pieces of chain that I take apart and use to perhaps add charms to things. And these little links have come in very handy. So I've got a couple of big links that can attach my sign to the pole, but I want to make it dangle slightly. So it takes me a little while, but I'm just removing a couple of links from this smaller chain and adding them to each end of my hanging sign, and then I'll add the bigger link to attach it to the pole. I love this kind of fiddling with small scale things. I just think it's lovely to see something looking so cute. So I've made my little sign and I just want to add some snow to the top of the pole. I'm just going to perch that somewhere to dry, and I also want, it's going to be very difficult to make the pole stick out of the side of the book. Perhaps if I'd have thought I could have got a drill in there, maybe it would have to be quite a small one, maybe put a slight hole in the side of the MDF. But I think if I make a little mound of snow on the edge of the aperture, and once it's sort of almost dry, just make an indentation the width of the barbecue skewer that I want to sit from that point, then if I add some hot glue, I think it will hold it in position. So I've had another thought about this book in that I could actually use some of the pages on the inside to add photographs of this Christmas. So I think I'm going to try and take a little family portrait and add them to the pages of this book. So I'm just adding a little touch of glitter. I'm really keeping my touch light. You can see I'm literally dotting it on those little snowy areas on the picture of the little girl, and I've just caught the little holly berries around Santa, and just adding a little bit of glamour dust to add a tiny bit of sparkle, not going too over the top, just making it look magical, hopefully. So now I want to make my book look even more realistic. Now, chances are that an old book would have some form of embellishment on the cover. So I want to keep it quite light. So I want some kind of oval on the front for my title, and then a couple of lines on the spine of the book. And I've decided to have a go at foiling these little ovals. I'm going to use this as a template, and I'm going to use a perfect medium ink pen to add the embossing powder. Now I missed this entirely, forgot to switch the camera on in my concentration. So just to let you know, there is a foiling video in my collection of videos where I make a Christmas card, and it does say that there is a foiling technique within that story. So I'll try and leave you a link at the end of this video so you can get to that if you need to see this. So I've just drawn around the aperture with my embossing pen and then added the Ranger sticky embossing powder. Now the trick is to do the next stage quickly. Heat the embossing powder and immediately it's melted, you need your foil flakes open and standing by. This is where you have to make sure that your heat gun doesn't blow them everywhere. And then immediately it's dry, you grab some of those flakes and just rub it over that sticky embossed ink. And then you remove the excess from the embossed lines by using a soft brush. And I repeated that process on the spine with a little piece of paper. So apologies for missing that with my camera. I just forgot to turn it back on when I went to collect my foiling supplies. So thinking about the final stages of the decoration of this book. So we've got our pages attached and we've got our scene almost complete, just needs the hanging sign sticking in position. So it's got snow on top of the sign, and I'm just going to remove a little bit, I'm just going to add, not remove, a little bit of glue to the end of the pole and into the little indentation in the little pile of snow that I created previously, and now I'm going to push that little pole into that indentation. Now the trick again is making sure that this is as straight as you can get it. So I'm just using my poker tool to get rid of any real chunks of hot glue, trying to keep things as neat as possible. And I just need to spend a minute or two just holding it in position while that glue cools down. And this piece is very difficult to show on camera, so I'm just going to use the poker tool to hold this up. Or not. As I said, it's very difficult. I'm giving up. So that's not quite hanging, it's leaning against the back of the book, but you get the picture. And that is the hanging sign ready on the inside of the aperture. So using I think it's a Tim Holtz Festive Foliage strip die, I've cut myself various pieces of Christmas foliage, and I'm just proceeding to glitter both sides using Rock Candy Distress Glitter. So I'm just spreading PVA glue on both sides of each of the pieces with my finger, quite messy, and then just dropping it into the glitter and coating both sides. Comes out looking like it's been dusted with sugar. Quite a nice frosty effect. And I'm just doing enough foliage to create a little arrangement on the front of my book. Now this bit is a little bit more unusual. You wouldn't normally have a little festive arrangement on the front of a book, so this is artistic license now. I want the cover of this book to look nice so that when it's sat on a coffee table it's quite attractive and tempts people to have a look inside and discover the surprise within. So just thinking about what I'm going to use, and I need a title, and I did think of using peel-offs. It looks quite nice, but it just looked a bit too pristine, and I thought perhaps I could put Christmas 2014 in Roman numerals, but I wasn't too keen on the peel-off, so I'm peeling it off. And I think I'm going to go with some gold embossing instead. So of the whole of this project, this is probably the piece that I'm least happy with. So I started out by thinking of foiling this, but the stamp that I was using just was a little bit too detailed. So in the end, I decided to go with gold embossing. So I'm just going to add, instead of the sticky embossing powder, I'm going to coat with gold embossing powder. And I'm not sure what it was about it that I didn't like. I think it was because it was a different colour to the foiling, and it was just a little bit too fussy for the front of the book. So I may well cover this up with another oval. I'm going to live with it a little while, see if it grows on me, perhaps scuff it up a little bit so it looks a little bit more aged. And but like I said, it's quite easy if I decide I don't like it to add another oval of that leather look book cover material, and then stamp it again with something else that I like a little better. So thinking about my arrangement and what's inside the actual Aperture, I decided that a little bit of red and white would look quite nice with my foliage. So I'm thinking of the bow that I'm going to add to this little arrangement of frosted foliage. So just using my heat gun to attach it to the bottom of the oval. And then I started out thinking I might use this metallic ribbon, and then I decided instead to go with some baker's twine. So thinking of Santa and his sleigh, I decided to add a couple of bells to my baker's twine, which I'm just colouring with some distress ink. This is where I decided not to use the ribbon because I couldn't thread it through the bells. So I'm just removing the bow that I initially tied. It was a double bow. So I've just heated up the glue with my heat gun, and it allows you to pull the little bow away. And then I'm just going to stitch a couple of those little sleigh bells to the bottom of the bow to finish the project. And the more I look at that lettering, the more I know that I am going to come back to this when I've got a little bit more time and revisit the title of the book. I think I'm going to go with Christmas 2014, and I'll just spend a little bit of time just putting in another oval over the top of the work that I've already got there, and it will give it a little bit of a raised area as well, which will look quite nice. So it was a little bit too pristine, so coming back in with that distress ink and also adding a little bit of that to the sign, so that it's not quite so brand new looking next to the old pages of the book. So North Pole this way. Phew, this was definitely a bit of a marathon video, so apologies for that, but I hope that I've given you plenty of details and things to think about if you decide to create a scene like this inside an altered book, whether you choose to cut through all the pages yourself or you contact the MDF Man and get him to send you a little kit so you can create this look a little bit easier. So I've really had great fun creating this magical scene, this little secret inside this little book that I hope looks like something that I've had for a long time. Hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, press the subscribe button, the like button, the share button as usual, and share the Christmas creativity. I hope to share another video with you before I have to give my computer into the menders. So until next time, thank you for watching. So if you follow this link to my blog, you'll find out a little bit more about where the MDF Man is. If you're in the UK, I definitely recommend, if you're nearby, go along to one of his workshops. Great value for money and great fun. Lots and lots of things to try out over there. This is the link to the foiling if you want to see how that's done. And I used it here to create this gorgeous and very luxurious Christmas card. And last but not least, if you're looking for something a little bit more challenging, why not visit my Etsy shop where you can see how to make projects just like this.